This was a tier 71 dungeon on our level now 88 Blood Surge Necromancer. The best part about this is that the build has an incredible amount of growth as far as gear is concerned. Just as like a quick sneak peek, I'm still using an item power 688 sacred pair of gloves that I found on day 2 of the ladder. The Blood Surge Necromancer is an amazingly powerful and tanky build that seeks to do a ton of AoE damage. And luckily, with the addition of the Barber in Season 1 and a couple of the different mechanics from the Hearts, as well as our now exhaustive list of things that do and do not work with Overpower, which again, I will link down below if you haven't seen my video most recently. I now have a list of everything that works with Overpower, so you don't have to guess anymore. But I wanted to introduce you to the build because it now can kind of deal damage to single targets. It's obviously not Bone Spear, it's not Bone Spirit, hell, it's not even Infinimist. Those builds aren't typically walking around with 17,000 maximum life at only level 88 with an equal amount of Fortify. So if you've been really interested in a super tanky build and maybe you didn't mesh well with the Bloodlance, maybe Blood Surge is the build for you. I'm going to start off with the skill tree. A couple of these things are going to change, and most notably the reason why I want to make this video is because the patch is about to come out. So one, I wanted to understand how to actually tell you all how to play the Blood Surge build if you've never piloted it yourself before. I wanted to have a lot more like nuanced experience with it. I've obviously played it, but I'm talking about way back in the day and in pre-season, and a bunch of things have changed. But the skill tree is going to look a little bit different tomorrow because we do want to max out Imperfectly Balanced once that bug is fixed. But the bones of this is absolutely going to work for you. So we're going with Hemorrhage. The interesting part is that you typically swap between Acolyte's Hemorrhage and Initiate's Hemorrhage. Because Corpse Tendrils and its ability to generate blood orbs is currently bugged in the game, and we don't really have an ETA for when that will be fixed. Oddly enough, it's kind of hard to fortify on Blood Surge. Blood Surge has a really low lucky hit chance, and we typically like to fortify via Drain Vitality, which is a lucky hit ability. So you might find yourself having some issues being able to fortify. We have a couple different ways of managing that. Typically, you want to use Acolyte's Hemorrhage just to increase that attack speed while healthy, so you can generate essence very quickly against a single target. The cool part is that Hemorrhage also has a really high lucky hit chance, so this can actually fortify you from Drain Vitality. But what you can also do is swap over to Initiate's Hemorrhage literally at the beginning of a dungeon, and then get your max Fortify off of a monster that might be a little bit easier for you to deal with, especially in higher Nightmare dungeons. You want to have your max Fortify because that's effectively doubling all of your damage, but also drastically increasing your survivability. So sometimes you swap here. Most of the time you want to be on Acolyte's Hemorrhage. Again, we're only putting 1 point into Blood Surge. It doesn't increase Overpower to put more ranks in, and we're using the automatic ability to overpower here. Remember the fact that, and this is very important, that Blood Surge is going to be healing you every single time that you hit a target, and if you hit multiple targets, it's going to heal you for double. It's going to be very important because tomorrow, I think there's a pretty good chance that the aspect Untimely Death is going to work with Blood Surge the way that it now works with Blood Lance. And because of that, we're basically overhealing all of the time. Once I find a new pair of Temerity Pants, I'll slap those on as well, be able to maintain my barrier, have constant overhealing, and potentially get a huge multiplier for Overpower. But again, we'll have to test that tomorrow. Just a single point to Unliving Energy. Once you can, we're going to max out Imperfectly Balanced. We'll have to pull out some points from elsewhere, like later on in the skill tree, but for right now, you only put the 1 point in. 3 points into Hued Flesh. This isn't as important as it is on some other builds, but I noticed only relying on Blood Mist's ability to generate a corpse meant that I often couldn't have Corpse Tendrils uptime 100%. So I want to have Corpse Tendrils up all the time. Not only is it one of our few multipliers with Grasping Veins, but it's just such an incredible amount of CC, and since we use it to apply Vulnerable now, because we can use that to scale the Barber's explosion damage, it's more important than ever on blood builds. Maxing out Blood Mist because we want to be able to Blood Mist all the time whenever Rathma's Vigor comes up. Rathma's Vigor allows us to overpower on Blood Mist, which we could only do 3% of the time. The other best part about this is that they're finally fixing the bug, and now when Rathma's Vigor goes off on Blood Mist, you're going to get the 1.5 multiplier from our Paragon Board, which you used to not get. Blood Mist was already an amazing tool for dealing single target damage, and now it's going to be 50% stronger, and that's just like bananas. So as much cooldown reduction as you possibly can, being able to generate corpses so we can have Corpse Tendrils up. Decrepify, obviously with that Pouring Decrepify, you don't need this on your skill bar, and in fact I was also messing around with Blight giving us the damage multiplier here because that also works with Overpower. It has some play along with the Blight pulls in targets on your boots to be able to generate more essence from Umbral. I don't hate it. I found that it was just not enough payoff for the investment. I'd rather be able to cast Decrepify at max range in case I can't stand near a target or safely stand near a target. But you obviously don't need this on your skill bar if you're using the Decrepit Heart, which I would recommend unless you want to use the damage reduction heart. Like if you're trying to like super survive tier 100s, like on a hardcore character, you might want to swap that out. Amplify damage because it actually works for our damage type. Death's Embrace doesn't increase our damage, but it is damage reduction. We want to be close to the target for the second part of Blood Surge's Nova as often as possible, so this seems like good enough for the 3 points. Maxing out Coalesce Blood, Tides of Blood, and Drain Vitality. We only have a single point into Corpse Tendrils right now. Luckily enough, with all of our different attacks hitting multiple targets, we're able to lucky hit and bring down this cooldown fairly often with Abhorrent Decrepify, so I don't think you need more points in it, but I do have ranks from my boots, and that's kind of good enough. Again, we're using Vulnerable very specifically to scale Barber's crit explosion damage. This does not work with Overpower. If you want, you can be running this with Blood Orbs, except again, it's currently bugged right now. Once it's not bugged, it becomes a really good option for generating Blood Orbs for one, overhealing, healing in general, and then generating Fortify from our Paragon board. So you might want to swap that out, again, if you're trying to be tankier. I have just 1 point into Necrotic Carapace, mostly so that we can have more instances of generating Fortify from Blood Mist here, just to keep Fortify up more often in case you're out of combat and it starts draining. Down here, we're using attack speed, which is super important on Blood Surge. One, to be able to duel out as much damage as possible, but also be able to hemorrhage and get back essence as quick as possible. And then obviously maxing out Standalone and Memento Mori. This is super important for all of our damage and survivability and our crit chance, which ends up being pretty important with the Barber. And then obviously we're running Bone Storm. This is mostly for the damage reduction and then to be able to proc crit preemptively on a bunch of targets within our range, so that Blood Surge's overpower damage is already being racked up whenever you overpower, so that the explosion damage, helps to multiply your overall damage output. The crit chance here, while not super important for our damage, does help to make the Barber crit and to be able to get into proccing the Barber as soon as possible. So it's not a dead stat. I super recommend picking this up. And then obviously Rathma's Vigor. I'm going to very quickly go over just the aspects that I'm currently using. I would typically go like stat by stat. This is basically the exact same setup for my Bloodlance build if you haven't seen that already. I will eventually also have this up on max roll, hopefully within a week or so. Once the patch comes out, I want to fine tune a couple things, but I mostly just want to talk about the aspects and why they're important. You can, pause at any time and take a look at the stats themselves in case you want to get an idea of what to prioritize. But basically maximum health and overpower and then damage reduction. Those are like your key stats. And then to a lesser extent, increased attack speed, critical strike chance, and lucky hit chance. But let's go through the rest of them as far as the aspects are concerned. Obviously, Disobedience for the best armor generation in the game. We're using Audacity here. I super love Audacity. It was even stronger when we were using Blight because I could like toss Blight into a pack of monsters, get them all grouped up, and then when I walked up, stun a ton of them. If you've never used Audacity, while it says you need to have at least 5 monsters, it will stun everything within its radius, which is like pretty decently large. And while it only happens once every 20 seconds, if you're using Shared Misery, which I highly recommend, you can take that stun and apply it to other targets outside of the range, since we're lucky hitting on them and Blood Surge is going to hit the entirety of the screen. So it's very easy to take this stun from this and apply it to the entirety of the screen, which works really well with Umbral to generate a ton of essence for us. But that's why I'm currently using Audacity. We're using Sacrifice on the gloves here. Sacrifice is just super important. It's one of the strongest aspects that you can get for scaling all of your survivability and all of your damage output. We're using Might on the pants. We want to be using Hemorrhage basically all of the time for nitpicking a little bit with a little bit extra essence here, a little bit of extra Fortify, and then just gaining 6 seconds of an additional 20% damage reduction is like obviously incredibly powerful. I'm using Ghostwalkers here for the Unstoppable gives you movement speed. It means when we're blood misting through a pack, I can kind of evade away from dangerous stuff that might have clumped up on top of me a bit easier. And it gives us some movement speed after to have a pseudo mobility skill. You could be using Wind Striker because you're going to be critting and running a lot of the time, especially when you're not pushing high nightmare dungeons. You're basically just going to like Blood Surge, blow up the screen and move on. So it's like pretty easy to stack movement speed that way. I just don't have a perfect roll of it. I think there's some merit for Ghostwalker, but I'm not necessarily sold on one or the other. This is post-edit Mac coming back in to realize that one, I hadn't tested it yet, so I have updated the sheet, but I initially had Bloodbathed on the amulet because I thought that this would actually impact overpower damage. Of course it doesn't impact overpower damage. Why would it ever? That means that you don't need to be wasting the amulet slot with this aspect. And I think ultimately if Untimely Death does work. It might be the strongest option to put here. The two other contenders for like best things to put on the amulet are probably Rathma's Chosen and Sacrificial. It comes down to whether or not you like to have that more consistent attack speed, which is what I might be leaning towards, or just the raw power from Sacrificial. But either one would do really well on the amulet. Again, once I have like the full planner set up, I'm going to have them all in their perfect place. But that's why I currently have it on the amulet. I was just a silly Billy, and this does not work to actually change the overpower damage at all. So you just take this and put this on an unimportant slot, and then put one of the much stronger aspects onto this slot. All right, back to the old video. We are using Rathma's Chosen. This is a pretty low roll Rathma's Chosen. Obviously a 50% would be much better. I just don't have one. Umbroll's great. Tomorrow, we will be able to play around with the concept of exposed flesh, being able to lucky hit generate essence, and I thought that that was going to be like really, really good for this build. The problem being that Blood Surge's lucky hit chance is just so minuscule. And keep in mind, this is after me having about 35 lucky hit bonus on my character. So even with like 50 or even like 60 or 70 lucky hit bonus, this thing isn't getting very high. And it's already like not 100% uptime when you're using Bone Spear and Exposed Flesh. So I just think that Blood Surge is not really a great candidate for it. I think it's like strictly for Sever and Bone Spear. So we end up using Umbral, and Umbral is just great. Obviously you can't generate essence against a single target like a boss using Umbral, but that's what Hemorrhage is for anyways. On the weapon, I currently have a Mineral Grasping Veins because I actually upgraded to this. This is actually like a pretty nutty weapon for us, considering the critical strike damage actually does work once the Barber crit procs, but the stats on it were just great. I literally put the aspect onto my old wand while I was setting up my gear for this setup. So I would much rather have a perfect roll here. And then for the shield is best in slot because it says maximum life, and maximum life is our base damage that we use to multiply with overpower. So don't sleep on maximum life, don't sleep on a shield, and this is where we have shared misery. For the Book of the Dead, we are sacrificing skirmishers to get that additional crit chance, which again just helps to proc the Barber more often, as well as the crit that's required to get the benefit from grasping veins. And then we're obviously sacrificing bone to get the huge overpower damage bonus, and then we're sacrificing blood for the additional life, which increases our base damage, which increases our overpower damage. You can also sacrifice Bone Golem for the increased attack speed. That's not terrible, and again might just be better on a speed farming setup in general, but I personally go with the blood one just because it's more survivability, more damage, just seems more better. For the Paragon tree, I'm actually just using the same Paragon tree as the Bloodlance build, which is currently on max roll, so you don't have to swap out anything at all. I'm not max level, so I don't have it all the way like built out right now, but just give you an idea if you don't want to go check out that build guide for whatever reason. We're using Blood Drinker on the starter board to be able to fortify off of blood orbs. We've touched on that a whole bunch, obviously. We do have Control on the Bloodbath board. Control works in the fact that its secondary bonus will increase our damage whenever we apply Decrepify or the stun, either from Audacity or for Grasping Veins. On the Scent of Death board, that's where you end up putting Dominate for the highest total overpower bonus. And then yes, the secondary effect of Dominate also works. We're literally just picking up Scent of Death for the damage reduction. The damage multiplier doesn't work. And we also want to branch over here into this maximum life node. Secondly, we would actually want to path over here into this board in two different directions, but we'll get to that in a quick second. So on Bone Graph, we actually want to be putting in Essence. The crit damage does help with Barber. The cool part is that the critical strikes deal 22% increased damage to targets who are not healthy, actually scales your overpower damage if your overpower successfully crits. That's again why Bone Storm ends up being so important on the build, as well as Grasping Veins. So this does work with overpower for whatever weird reason. You can also path down here into the Essence on Kill, which helps for speed farming, and then path over here for the additional life and the additional armor. We build up into the Blood Begets Blood board because this is one of the only places where you can actually get overpower magic nodes. Even the rare node doesn't have overpower on it. I think this is just wrong, if I'm being honest with you. But we want to put a glyph here that's going to amplify magic nodes so we can get even more overpower damage out of it. And then we also use Amplify because when we're able to apply Decrepify, this does work with overpower as well. We're also going to path into this board one more time to be able to pick up this overpower damage and these overpower nodes that are here. And then lastly, we end up pathing up into Flesh Eater, very specifically oriented in this way, just to be able to pick up color as well as these two attack speed nodes. So that's what the rest of the Paragon board will look like once you have maximum Paragon points. So that's the build in its entirety. I hope that this helps. If you're already theory crafting for tomorrow's patch, I hope that this gets to you before you see those changes so you can have a better idea of what I'm personally thinking about trying for the build in general. Like I said, give me about a week and I'll actually have a build guide up on Maxroll just so that you don't have to like reference this video every single time. And I'm going to have everything fine-tuned there, everything like perfectly written out with perfect stats to look for, stat priorities, etc. You know, the typical stuff that we have on a Maxroll guide. But again, if you are looking for that or that kind of information, check out the Bloodlands guide because it's effectively the same build, prioritizing slightly different stats to make up for the difference in single target damage that Blood Surge is kind of lacking, while maximizing the AoE damage, which it tends to do better than Bloodlance itself. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. I want to be getting a bunch of build guide updates out now that the patch is coming, because there are quite a few things that are a bit stronger with the changes in the patch for the Necro, even though it doesn't really look like we're getting a ton of buffs. There's like pretty monumental additional bonuses to those builds. So I'm going to keep pumping out content here. So again, if you haven't already, consider hitting the button. I would really appreciate it. Thank you very much for watching the video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.